Louis XIV, an absolute monarch who quashed all rivals and a crucial architect of the modern state. Or was he? This once dominant view has come under serious scrutiny. Louis is now seen as not only having been seriously limited in his ability to exercise centralized power, but rather than trampling over rival power bases, he is seen to have collaborated with them. Is it possible to reconcile these two interpretations? In order to do so, we must view Louis's use of collaboration and his use of authoritarianism together as part of a whole, rather than creating a dichotomy between them. By doing so, we may also get a better understanding of them individually. For instance, on closer inspection, Louis's collaboration may look more like co-option.
The Duchess de Bourgogne was on such terms of playful familiarity with the king and Madame de Maintenon that she used to go through their papers when they were there and even open their letters. One day she began running through the papers on the desk. Madame de Maintenon, who was sitting the other side of the room and was the only person present, told her more seriously than usual to stop it. That was enough to make the princess thoroughly curious, and laughing, she went on, until suddenly she came across a letter about herself. The letter was a detailed report of everything the Duchess had said or done for the last 4 or 5 days, set down in the most intimate of detail, as if Madame de Epinay, who in fact saw her but seldom, had in fact never let her out of her sight.
That passage from the diaries of Saint-Simon paints a picture of a royal court filled with jealousy and rivalry, where courtiers informed on each other to gain the king's favour. Indeed, this atmosphere was deliberately cultivated by Louis XIV, who from the beginning of his reign made access to the royal person ritualised and competitive. The prize was France's ultimate source of patronage. Patronage most commonly took the form of military or bureaucratic appointments, along with their associated incomes. It was both a reward for past service and a guarantee that the recipient would continue as their patron's political client. Pressure to live beyond their means by aristocratic society, it was a crucial source of income for many in the nobility. By making access competitive, Louis was able to achieve several goals. First, he was able to spy on his subjects, as Saint-Simon's account shows. Second, as provincial officials seeking patronage would compete to achieve the goals set out publicly by the king, it lowered the costs of carrying out policy. These uses appear clearly in line with the collaboration thesis. Unable to maintain a surveillance state or centralized bureaucracy, Louis promised patronage in return for others taking on these functions. But the use of patronage that most concerns us here is Louis and his ministers' use of clients to control independent political institutions. As dawn broke on the 13th of August 1669, the judges of the Parlement of Paris donned their red robes and assembled in the Grand Chamber for a lit de justice. Outside the palace, units of the French and Swiss guards lined the streets leading to the Saint-Honoré gate. Chancellor Seguier, now 81, appeared at the palace at 8 a.m. A deputation of senior judges helped him to his place. Louis XIV reached the gate at 9 a.m. and proceeded to the palace in the company of his soldiers. After hearing mass in the adjacent Sainte-Chapelle, he entered the Grand Chamber escorted by the usual deputation of magistrates, but also by a company of Swiss guards, and amid the sound of drums, trumpets and fifes, an unusual military panoply. The king registered some 25 acts, perhaps more than in any lit de justice ever held. Given this quantity of legislation, itself an affront to the traditions of the Parlement, the clerk could read these laws only in part, making it impossible to assess their contents. When the clerk had finished, Seguier went through the motions of consultation, after which he proclaimed these laws registered in the name of the king. When the ceremony ended, Louis XIV left the Grand Chamber abruptly and without speaking, barely nodding to those magistrates along the aisle down which he marched with his soldiers. Where the lit de justice of 1667 had shown respect for the dignity of the Parlement, this one seemed designed to humiliate it. That was historian John Hurt's interpretation of an eyewitness account of Louis's 1669 lit de justice at the Paris Parlement. The Parlement, courts with whom the king registered new laws, are perhaps the clearest example of Louis's authoritarianism. When registering a new law in the Parlement, there were two potential processes. The normal process allowed the Parlement to make remonstrances against the new legislation, as well as engage in several delaying tactics, one of the most common being referring the legislation to local pays d'etat, provincial estates which would use it as a bargaining chip in their negotiations over royal taxes. The second was a lit de justice, where the king or his governor would register the legislation in person, overruling any objections. For kings before and after Louis XIV, this was often an unreliable and dangerous method, but under his rule it became an accepted practice. To achieve this, Louis and his minister Colbert used the power of the patronage to its fullest extent. Colbert quickly ensured all first presidents of the Parlement, who were royal appointees, were his own clients. Next, Colbert used patronage's power of surveillance to look into his magistrates' financial situations, and thus identify more potential clients. Louis then began to use the lit de justice more frequently, and as suggested by Hurt, more provocatively. He also combined the carrot of patronage with the stick of exile for those magistrates who resisted the compulsory registrations. Once the reliability of the lit de justice was secure, in the early 1670s Colbert began to challenge resistance to normal registration by introducing new taxes threatening the magistrates' incomes. Immediately met with resistance, Colbert and Louis, backed by further exiles, were able to not only ban referrals to the pays d'état, but also end the right of the Parlement to remonstrance before registering the law, rendering them docile for the remainder of his rule. The banning of referral to the pays d'état is a further hint of how authoritarian and collaborative governance were intertwined. The pays d'état was central to Louis's rule. Historical custom made taxing through prerogative prone to strong resistance, while the lack of any higher authority made lending to the king risky. The pays d'état helped resolve both these issues by providing taxes and acting as intermediaries in credit markets. Their usefulness meant that Louis's dealings with them were often truly collaborative, and that not only did Louis gain, but so did the landlords represented in the estates at the expense of their regional rivals, such as merchants and the peasantry. But Louis was not a benign actor. When the Assembly of Provence took on a larger role in local governance, this was welcomed by Louis, as rather than negotiating with a multitude of local actors, he could simply use those of his powers that best targeted the Assembly alone. In particular, the creation of offices that threatened its fiscal sovereignty. The result was that just as the Assembly was losing its bargaining chip of legislation referred to it by the Parlement, it was reduced to a position where royal taxes were not the outcome of negotiations, but are the precondition for them to begin. A definitive link between the two would require further research, but it suggests that rather than being able to view Louis's dealings with the estates and Parlement as two opposing models of royal governance, the two were intertwined, the offer of collaboration coming with the threat of punishment. So while the shift in attention towards Louis's collaboration was certainly needed, it must be understood as a complement to more authoritarian and centralized governance. A rosy atmosphere of mutually beneficial collaboration? This was not.